All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Still on World War II, Ebb of Aggression, 1941 to 1945. On page 800, second paragraph down. Link to the PDF in the description if you want to read this yourself. All right. The shift to city bombing was more or less accidental. In spite of the erroneous ideas of Chamberlain, Baldwin, Churchill, and the rest, the war opened and continued for months with no city bombing at all, for the simple reason that the Germans had no intentions, no plans, or no equipment for strategic bombing. The British, who had the intentions but still lacked the plans and equipment, also held back. After the fall of France, where almost all German bombardment was tactical or psychological, with the major exception of the attack on Rotterdam, the Battle of Britain was fought and lost by tactical bombing on shipping and occasional aerodromes or airplane factories. The attack on cities began by accident when a group of German planes, which were lost, dumped their bomb loads, contrary to orders, on London on August 24, 1940. The Royal Air Force retaliated by bombing Berlin the next night. On September 2, 1940, as counter-retaliation, Göring announced the beginning of city bombardment for September 7th, but the policy had already begun with a series of attacks on Liverpool after August 28th. The British efforts to counterattack by daylight raids on military objectives in Germany resulted in such losses that the air offensive was shifted to night attacks. This entailed also a shift from industrial targets to indiscriminate bombing of urban areas. This was justified with the wholly mistaken argument that civilian morale was a German weak point and that the destruction of workers' housing would break this morale. The evidence shows that the German war effort was not weakened in any way by lowering of civilian morale, in spite of the horrors heaped upon it. Now, see, I think this is kind of what people were talking about Churchill being just as bad as Hitler, because it does seem that the Nazis were originally not bombing civilian targets. In 1942, an effort was made to begin 1,000-bomber raids against a single target in one night, and 3 of these were carried out. The first at Cologne on May 30th. This was a terrible shock to the Germans, but had little impact on their ability to wage war. Since the British Bomber Command had about 450 first-line bombers, a raid as large as that on Cologne required use of all reserves and training planes, with instructors flying about a quarter of the planes. Of 1,046 planes sent off, 898 reached the target and dropped 1,455 tons of bombs, with 40 planes lost in action and 12 more damaged beyond repair. In the city, 474 persons were killed, 565 hospitalized, over 5,000 injured, 45,000 made homeless, and hundreds of factories destroyed. Yet the life of the city was back to normal in 2 weeks, with war production in the city back to normal in about 6 weeks. The next 1,000-plane raid, really 956, on Essen 2 days after the attack on Cologne, was so ineffective, partly from cloudy weather, that the German air defense did not even report an attack on Essen that night, while reporting attacks on 3 other Ruhr cities. Improvements in finding their targets, heavier attacks, and the arrival of the American 8th Air Force, which inaugurated round-the-clock bombing in 1943, increased the damage from strategic bombing of Germany without reducing the scale of the German war effort. This failure resulted from a number of factors which should be understood. The chief one was that the Western governments had, from 1933 on, entirely misconceived the nature and amount of German munitions production. It was overestimated by a wide margin, twofold or threefold, in 1933 to 1943, and was underestimated by an equal margin in 1943 to 1945. The British assumed that there was full industrial mobilization for war in Germany as early as 1938, but this was never achieved and was not even attempted until December 1943. Consequently, Germany, until the winter of 1944 to 1945, had a cushion of unmobilized resources which allowed an astonishing rapid repair of bomb damage and even more astonishing increase in production of war goods as late as January 1945. Failure by the Western powers to analyze the German war economy led to changeable and misguided efforts to attack it. When successful attacks were made on vital objects, such as ball bearing or chemical plants, they were not followed up, thus giving the Germans time to repair or even to disperse these facilities. Much effort was expended on bombing almost wholly unrewarding targets, such as airfields, submarine pens, ports, railroad yards, tank factories, and others. For a variety of reasons, these targets could not be damaged sufficiently to make substitution or repair impossible. The original decision for the combined bomber offensive in January 1943 gave highest target priority to submarine construction yards. A fraction of the planes and crews used in this unremunerative task could have contributed greatly to defeat the submarine if they had been used in night searches for the submarines themselves on the Atlantic. As early as June 10, 1943, the combined bomber offensive top priority was shifted from submarine yards to German fighter plane production. But here the error was made in concentrating on body and assembly plants, of which there were many, instead of on engine factories, which there were few and more vulnerable. By April 1944, with production of German fighter planes increasing rapidly, this effort had failed, and the bomber offensive at last turned in May 1944 towards a vulnerable target: airplane fuel production. To this was added, in October 1944, an attack on the general rail and canal transport system. The fuel attack incidentally disrupted the chemical industry, and this combination, along with transportation, brought the German economic base for war to its knees in February 1945. The delay was partly caused by lack of determination in concentrating on targets selected and the constant attraction of the mirage of city bombing. Even after May 1944, when the chief target was fuel factories, only 16% of the bombs dropped were aimed at these, and 27% were still being thrown away on bombing civilian residences in cities. The importance of choosing the correct target in strategic bombing may be seen from one incidental and probably accidental success. The Germans had only one factory producing the Maybach heavy HL engine used in their Tiger and Panther tanks. This was destroyed by an aerial bomb in 1944. This immobilized hundreds of these heavy tanks on the Russian front and contributed substantially to a successful Russian breakthrough. The British efforts to break German civilian morale by area night bombing was an almost complete failure. In fact, one of the inspiring and amazing events of the war was the unflinching spirit and under unbearable attack shown by ordinary working people in industrial cities. This was true in Russia, in Moscow, and above all Leningrad, as it was in Germany or Britain, above all in the dock areas in East London. Attacks on these peoples had greater influence on their morale or on the morale of their soldiers fighting on the front than it did on the suffering peoples themselves. The most extraordinary example of this suffering occurred in the British fire raids on Hamburg in 1943. For more than a week, beginning on July 24th, Hamburg was attacked with a mixture of high explosive and incendiary bombs so heavily and persistently that entirely new conditions of destruction known as firestorms appeared. The air in the city, heated to over 1,000 degrees, began to rise rapidly, with the result that ground level winds of gales or even hurricane force rushed into the city. These winds were so strong as to knock people off their feet or to move flaming beams and walls through the air. The heat was so intense that normally non-flammable substances burned and fires were ignited yards from any flame. The water supply was destroyed on July 27th, but the flames were too hot for water to be effective. It turned to steam before it could reach flaming objects, and all ordinary methods of quenching flames by depriving them of oxygen were made impossible by the storm of fresh air roaring in from the suburbs. Nevertheless, the supply of oxygen could not keep up with the combustion, and great layers of carbon monoxide settled in the shelters and basements, killing the people huddled there. Those who tried to escape through the streets were enveloped in flames as if they were walking through a searing jet of blowtorch. Some who wrapped themselves in blankets dipped in water from a canal were scalded as the wind turned suddenly to steam. Hundreds were cremated and their ashes dispersed by the wind. No final figures for the destruction were possible until 1951, when they were set by German authorities at 40,000 dead, including 5,000 children, 250,000 houses destroyed, about half the city, with over 1 million persons made homeless. This was the greatest destruction by air attacks on a city until the fire raid on Tokyo of March 9, 1945, which still stands today as the most devastating air attack in human history. The arrival of the American Strategic Air Forces and the beginning of the Combined Bomber Offensive in the summer of 1943 gave a new turn to the air attack on Germany. The first great American effort against Schweinfurt, a city which produced 80% of German ball bearings, showed the difficulty of the American aim of precision daylight bombing of military targets. October 14, 1943. A force of 228 heavy bombers dropped 450 tons of explosives on the target, but 62 planes and 599 men failed to return. Such losses could not be sustained, and resulted from the fact that escorting fighter planes were of such short range that they had to turn back at the German border. As a result, Schweinfurt was not bombed again for 4 months, during which most of its ball-bearing production was dispersed to 5 small nearby towns. A series of well-aimed attacks after February 21st, 1944, cut production about a quarter in the next 8 weeks, but this had little influence on Germany's fighting power. The figures on German munitions production are revealing. In 1944, when Germany had armed forces of about 150 full divisions of 12,000 men each, it manufactured sufficient armaments to equip completely 250 infantry and 40 panzer divisions. In some cases, full expansion continued into 1945. The total production of munitions in Germany in January 1945 was a quarter larger than in January 1943. Aircraft production in January 1945 was the same as January 1944, and both were almost 40% over January 1943. Production of weapons in January 1945 was 4% more than the same month in 1944. Production of tanks, with January-February 1942 taken as 100, was up 54% in January 1943, up 338% in January 1944, and up 457% in January 1945. The following figures for actual production of specific items will help put the strategic bombing of Germany into perspective. Okay, so he's got a chart here on page 804. We're just going through military aircraft, tanks, heavy anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, small arms, ammunition. It would probably not be unfair to say that Germany in January 1945, after 2 years of heavy air bombardment from the Western powers, was not only outproducing the United Kingdom on most significant items of military equipment, but also had improved its relative position. Some of this, of course, can be attributed to the fact that the United States was taking over production of some items, but the chief cause was the unbelievable economic mobilization of Germany in the year from December 1943 to December 1944. The relative costs of the strategic bombing effort may be shown in the figures. The Americans and British together lost 40,000 planes and 150,000 airmen, almost equally divided between them. The Germans suffered about 330,000 civilians killed, almost 1 million injured, and about 8 million made homeless. For the last year and a half of the war, over 1 million Germans were employed clearing and repairing bomb damage. All these things contributed indirectly to hamper the German war effort. The direct contribution of strategic bombing to the war effort came chiefly after September 1944 and was to be found mainly in the disruption of fuel and transportation. Even this could have been avoided if Hitler had been willing to take the advice of his subordinates and adopt proper defensive measures against Western air attacks. Hitler himself insisted on priority of flak anti-aircraft guns over fighter planes and of retaliatory bombing of England over defense by German fighter planes. Both mistaken decisions. If the men and materials which Germany devoted its efforts to bomb England had been entirely used for defensive fighter planes, the influence of Allied strategic bombing on the outcome of the war would have been insignificant. Germany would still have been defeated because in the long run its position was hopeless once Hitler attacked Russia while Britain was still undefeated. This defeat arose from the destruction of the German armies in battle and was made inevitable from the economic point of view by the loss of the Romanian oil supply in August 1944 and the loss of the Ruhr industrial region in April 1945. One unforeseen and still largely unrecognized event in the defeat of Germany's ground armies was Hitler's greater resistance to Western than to Soviet advances. It had been assumed, especially in the Kremlin, that Hitler's hatred of communism would lead him to weaken his defenses in the West in order to resist more effectively the advance of Russia. He did exactly the opposite. In the late summer of 1944, 2/3 of Germany's fighting men were resisting the Russians in the east, 2 million in all, with 300,000 in Italy and 700 elsewhere in the west. By the time of Yalta, February 1st, 1945, Germany had 106 divisions in the west, of which 27 were in Italy, facing an equal number of slightly larger divisions of the Western powers, while they had 133 in the east, 24 less than on June 1st, 1944, of which only 75, including 4 armored, faced Russia's 100 divisions with 80 more in reserve along the 600-mile front from the Carpathian Mountains to the Baltic. This shift in German forces can be explained on military grounds, but the real causes were much deeper and were embedded in the distorted recesses of Hitler's brain and in the very nature of Nazism. In spite of Hitler's verbal attacks on communism, his real hatred was directed at the values and traditions of Western civilization and at Christian and middle-class ways of life. This hatred impelled him to overrule the objections of his military commanders in order to mobilize all his dwindling reserves of manpower and supplies, especially truck transport and gasoline, to hurl his final offensive effort against the Western powers on December 16, 1944. This futile effort stopped the Western attack on Germany for 2 months, but opened the East to annihilating Soviet blows, which began on January 12, 1945. The Western ground attack on Germany was not resumed after the Battle of the Bulge until February 8, 1945. 2 months later, a pincers was extending eastward, north and south of the Ruhr. On April 1st, this closed to complete the encirclement of the great industrial area. 17 days later, Field Marshal Walter Model surrendered his 325,000 Germans and at once killed himself. 10 days later, the German-Italian forces in Italy, trapped in Lombardy between Army Group C and impassable swamp areas, sea and river, began to surrender a force about 3 times as large. On April 28th, Mussolini, on his way to the Swiss frontier with extensive treasure, was captured and killed by Italian guerrillas. His body was taken back to Milan, scene of his earlier triumphs, to hang by the heels in a public square alongside that of his mistress, Clara Pedicacci, or Pedicici. I don't know how to pronounce that. It's 2 C's and an I. The long-drawn Italian campaign, which had served its purpose by tying down dozens of German divisions in the peninsula, ended with a total of 536,000 Germans and 312,000 Allied casualties. Meanwhile, General Eisenhower, following the victory in the Ruhr, ignored Berlin to the northeast and drove directly eastward towards Dresden. He was unduly disturbed by rumors that the Germans had prepared a final defensive redoubt in southeastern Germany. Churchill and others, for political bargaining purposes, wanted the American advance redirected to Berlin, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington refused to interfere with Eisenhower's decisions in the field. These decisions, based on military considerations only and ignoring political factors, permitted the Soviet forces to liberate all of the capital cities of Central Europe. Budapest fell to the Russians on February 13th, followed by Vienna on April 13th. On April 25th, Russian forces encircled Berlin and made contact with American troops 70 miles to the south, at Torgau on the Elbe. The previous day, Eisenhower, advancing on Prague, had been warned by the Soviet General Staff that Russian forces would occupy the Moldau Valley, which included the Czech Republic, as late as May 4th, when the American forces were 60 miles from Prague and the Soviet armies more than 100 miles from the city, An effort by the former to advance to the city was stopped at the request of the Soviet commander, despite the last vain message from Churchill to Eisenhower to take the Czech capital for political bargaining purposes. In the meantime, the Russian troops, screaming, looting, and raping, were smashing into Berlin. On April 20th, following Hitler's 56th birthday celebration, which most of the Nazi Party and military leaders attended, the Fuhrer refused to leave the doomed city. Most of the rest escaped that night through the last narrow corridor to central Germany. For another 9 days, Hitler continued to telephone orders from his bunker in the garden of the new Chancellery building, but few paid any attention to these. His former lieutenants were scattered throughout central Germany, intriguing to take over as leader or planning to vanish from sight. Only Goebbels and his wife and 6 young children and Hitler's mistress Eva Braun planned to remain to the end. The Fuhrer experienced a complete mental breakdown on April 22nd. A week later, only a few subordinates remained to carry out his last wishes. With Russian shells falling all about the Chancellery, he married Eva Braun, ordering Göring and Himmler arrested for treachery, and drew up a political testament which blamed the war and all Germany's misfortunes on the Jews and told the nation the aim must still be to win territory in the East for the German people. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, with the Russian soldiers only a block away, Eva Braun took poison and Hitler shot himself through the mouth. Subordinates, in accord with their instructions, flooded the bodies with gasoline and burned them in a Russian shell hole in the Chancellery garden. At Hitler's death, leadership of the wreckage of Germany was bequeathed to Admiral Karl Dönitz. His efforts to surrender to the Western powers while continuing the war against the Soviet Union were rebuffed on May 4th, and 3 days later all German forces were surrendered unconditionally to all the victor powers. The latter's armies continued to advance, overrunning concentration and prison camps with the ovens still hot, finding thousands of bodies of murdered inmates stacked up like cordwood, with other thousands staggering out like walking skeletons in filthy rags to meet the incredulous gaze of well-fed, soft-hearted American youths. Soon the names Buchenwald, Dachau, and Belsen were being repeated with horror throughout the world. At Belsen, 35,000 dead bodies and 30,000 still breathing were found. The world was surprised and shocked. There was no excuse for the surprise, for Hitler's aims and those methods, including the genocide of any peoples or groups his twisted mind condemned, had been common knowledge among students of Nazism long before 1939, and had been explicitly advocated in Mein Kampf, a book which sold 227,000 copies before Hitler came to power and over 1 million copies in 1933, his first year as Chancellor. That Hitler's government in practice was making every effort to carry out all the vile purposes which it embraced in theory had been made explicitly clear to all informed persons by 1939, most notably, perhaps, in The Revolution of Nihilism by Hermann Rauschning, a former Nazi leader in Danzig, or the Brown Books of the Hitler Terror, based on evidence from refugees and published in 1933. There was no excuse for the world's press to be surprised at Nazi bestiality in 1945, since the evidence had been fully available in 1938. By V.E. Day, May 8, 1945, this bestiality had brought death to more than 30 million human beings as sacrifices to mystic German tribalism. Okay. The next section is closing in on Japan, 1943 to 1945. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Japan was already defeated but could not make itself accept unconditional surrender and was trying to stave off that inevitable end by suicide tactics. In the 35 months from the Battle of Midway to the German surrender, the Japanese Navy and Merchant Marine had been swept from the Western Pacific and largely destroyed in the process, cutting the home islands off from vital overseas supplies and leaving millions of their armed forces isolated in Southeast Asia, China, New Guinea, the Philippines, and other island pockets. The war against Germany and the war against Japan were separate wars, although involving the same victorious nations. Weapons, strategy, and tactics were quite different, chiefly because one was a war of air and land while the other was a struggle of naval and air forces over an immense ocean. Even American strategic bombing was different in the Pacific, using B-29s, unknown in Europe, for area bombing of civilians and cities, something we disapproved in Europe. The great weapons against Japan were the aircraft carriers, which relentlessly prowled the ocean and provided the necessary protection for amphibious assaults on the island's stepping stones, which led to Japan. The total destruction of the Japanese Navy and Air Force were almost incidental to this process of protecting landing forces of Marines and Army units. Even where the same weapons were used in the European and Pacific struggles, the outcomes were different. In the former, the German submarines were hunted down and destroyed, while in the Pacific, American submarines made a great contribution to victory by the almost total annihilation of Japanese merchant fleet. Japan's minimal need for merchant shipping to keep its civilian population from starvation was about 2 million tons. It had started the war with 6 million tons, added 3.5 million tons during the war from building and capture of foreign vessels, but had 8.2 million tons sunk during the war and finally surrendered with only 231 vessels of 860,000 tons still able to operate. The loss of 5.1 million tons were sunk by submarines, 2.3 million by aircraft, and 0.3 million by mines. By the spring of 1945, Japanese merchant shipping was already below its minimum civilian survival level. Immediately after Midway, the vital issue for the United States became the need to stop the Japanese advance against Australia in the southwestern Pacific. At that same time, the southern edge of the Japanese defense perimeter ran east and west through New Guinea, just north of Australia. Its advanced base was Rabaul on New Britain Island, taken from Australia in January 1942. This base, a magnificent but remote harbor 3,000 miles from Tokyo, was linked to the Japanese capital by two fortified bases which had been constructed illegally in the Japanese mandated islands. About 800 miles north of Rabaul was Truk in the Caroline Islands, and almost 700 miles north of Truk was Saipan in the Marianas Islands. From Saipan, later a B-29 base for bombing Tokyo, it was almost 1,600 miles to the Japanese capital. Just before Midway, the Japanese extended their threat 600 miles further south from Rabaul, southwest to New Guinea, thus threatening Australia and southeast Guadalcanal, the southernmost of the Solomon Islands, 2,375 miles north of Wellington, New Zealand. The American counterattack to this Japanese southward push took the form of two parallel thrusts northward, passing to the east and west of Rabaul and Truk. The Western thrust under General MacArthur aimed to reconquer New Guinea and moved northward through the Admiralty Islands and the Philippines to the China Sea. The Eastern American thrust, under naval control, sought to go northward through the Solomon Islands, then bypass Rabaul and Truk far to the east through the Marshall Islands, returning to the Tokyo Road by attacking the marinas from the Marshall Islands, 700 miles east of Truk. This double movement is usually referred to as a ladder, in which alternate advances on either side by the Americans led to Japanese counterattacks from Rabaul and Truk between the two legs. At first, much of the fighting was piecemeal, with inadequate supplies for both sides, but American supplies continued to come, while Japanese support was much more intermittent. This eventually became the story of the Pacific War, as American supplies delivered from 6,000 or more miles away buried the Japanese beneath water and earth. This struggle northward from Australia and New Zealand was to have been accompanied by a third thrust under General Joseph W. Stilwell and Lord Louis Mountbatten from India across Burma to re-establish connections with southwestern China. For some time, it was expected that MacArthur and Stilwell, converging on China from the Philippines and Burma, would establish a mainland base from which the final assault on Japan could be made. The Burma campaign, held up by the difficulties of the terrain and constant diversion of men and supplies to other theaters, did not reach China over the hand-built Burma Road until February 1945. MacArthur was held up for 2 years, 1942 to 1944, in the New Guinea area. Thus, we must focus our attention on the eastern drive from New Zealand northward through the Solomons. This eastern drive began on August 7, 1942, when the Guadalcanal was invaded by naval and marine forces from Wellington, New Zealand, 2,375 miles further south. By February 8, 1943, after 6 months of horrible jungle combat, often without either air or sea support, the Solomons were conquered. 6 drawn naval battles during the struggle greatly weakened the enemy surface forces, while his air forces were crippled. In the same period, Japanese advance bases were expelled from the Aleutian Islands. At least 135,000 enemy ground forces were left isolated in New Guinea and Rabaul. By the autumn of 1943, the Allied forces had reached the Great Barrier of the Japanese-mandated islands in the Central Pacific. These were passed in a series of amphibious operations called island hopping. The first of these, Tarawa in the Gilbert Archipelago, was a small operation in comparison with subsequent landings, but its name still brings horror to those who remember it. In 4 days, 3,100 Marines were torn to pieces, a third fatally, to capture a small coral island defended by 2,700 Japanese with 2,000 civilian laborers. The fanaticism of the Japanese was a revelation and may be measured by the fact that 4,500 were killed. We learned a great deal about amphibious warfare at Tarawa, especially the need for thorough preliminary naval bombing and for detailed knowledge and planning in regards to tides, winds, reefs, and local fire support. In February 1943, this experience was applied at Kwajalein, the world's largest atoll, 560 miles north of Tarawa, and Inwetok, 340 miles west of Kwajalein. in the Marshall Islands. In these landings, Americans had their first large scale experience of the irrationalities of fighting Japanese. Officers of the Mikado attacked tanks with ornamental swords, while privates sometimes killed themselves when they had Americans at their mercy. But usually they fought skillfully and tenaciously until the outcome was hopeless when they made suicidal banzai charges. These two landings cost 695 Americans dead to kill 11,000 Japanese. During these operations, Admiral Raymond Spruance led a carrier attack force in a strike on Truk, which destroyed over 2,000 Japanese planes and a dozen naval vessels at the cost of 17 American aircraft. In the course of 1943, the American advance up the right leg of the Pacific Ladder to Tokyo got so far ahead of schedule that several projected landings were eliminated. All future landings were advanced in date by a couple of months, and the whole weight of the advance was shifted from its original project of a final assault on Japan from Formosa or the Asiatic mainland to an undated and unspecific amphibious attack from Pacific bases. This left three major problems. One, the need for an island close enough to Japan for preliminary bombardment by land-based planes. Two, the possibility of very large American casualties when the Japanese invasion came off, possibly in 1946. And three, what could be done about the millions of Japanese ground forces in northern China and Manchuria. The last two of these problems led to efforts to obtain Soviet intervention in the war against Japan. They meant almost certainly that considerable concessions must be made to the Russians in the Far East, and that the final assault on Japan must be left until several months after the defeat of Germany to allow Soviet forces to be shifted from Europe to the Far East. In the meantime, the need for an air base for land-based bombers within range of Japan resulted in the conquest of the Marianas Islands. The Marianas were 700 miles north of Truk, over 1,000 miles northwest of Inwittock, and almost 1,600 miles from Tokyo. The conquest of Saipan in the middle of this archipelago in June and July of 1944 was the second great amphibious landing that summer. Two Marine divisions under Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith hitting the beach at Saipan on June 15th, only 9 days after D-Day in Normandy. The Japanese had 29,000 men on Saipan, 7,000 on Tinian, and 18,000 on Guam. All three were eliminated by the end of July. Japanese resistance was so intense on Saipan that an American Army division held in reserve at sea for the other islands had to be thrown ashore at Saipan on the second day. That island was conquered by July 9th with 27,000 of the Japanese garrison of 32,000 killed to 3,400 Americans dead and 13,000 wounded. Over 24,000 Japanese and 2,000 Americans were killed on the other two islands. Efforts by the Japanese fleet to disrupt the Marianas attack led to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19th through 20th, 1944. This was another naval battle in which no surface vessels fired upon or even saw each other, since it was fought entirely in the air and under the surface. On the opening day, the Japanese lost 402 planes while destroying 26 American planes, and 2 of their carriers were sunk by American submarines. As the Japanese fleet, denuded of air protection, fled westward, Spruance's planes pursued and sank a carrier and several lesser vessels at a cost of 20 planes. This engagement shattered the Japanese naval air support and left the Philippines open to American assault. In September 1944, another amphibious attack landed in the Palau group of the Western Caroline Islands, 1,175 miles directly west of Truk and only 610 miles directly east of Mindanao, the large southern island of the Philippines. Feverish haste was made to conquer this group and to prepare Ulithi Atoll, the best harbor in the area, as a base for American surface vessels, since the invasion of Leyte in the Philippines had been moved up from December 20th to October 20th, only 4 weeks after the occupation of Ulithi on September 23rd. The invasion forces of 2 divisions had left Hawaii on September 15th with their original destination at Yap, just south of Ulithi, but were diverted to rendezvous with 2 divisions from MacArthur at sea, 450 miles east of Leyte. In the meantime, in the first half of 1944, the Japanese fleet shifted from the Island Sea of Japan to Linga Roads off Singapore in order to be closer to a supply of fuel oil, and the Japanese army on the mainland of China drove southward from Hankow to Hanoi, Indochina, cutting Chiang Kai-shek off from all eastern China and overrunning the American strategic bombing bases in the area. On July 27th, President Roosevelt, Admiral Chester Nimitz, and General MacArthur, meeting at Pearl Harbor, decided to speed up the assault on Japan, to recapture the Philippines without awaiting the defeat of Germany, and to force Japan to accept our terms of surrender by the use of sea and air power without an invasion of the Japanese homeland. On September 13th, Admiral William F. Hazley suggested cancellation of 4 projected intermediate landings and use of these troops for the intermediate seizure of Leyte. The suggestion, conveyed to Roosevelt and Churchill at the Second Quebec Octagon Conference, was approved and ordered within 90 minutes, September 15, 1944. The Palau landing began the same day. Both the time and place of the American landing at Leyte were anticipated in Tokyo, but the Japanese were unable to reinforce the single division on the spot. To cover the landing, Admiral Halsey led the Third Fleet of 9 fleet carriers, 8 escort carriers, 6 battleships, 14 cruisers, and a partridge in a pear tree, and 58 destroyers to pound the Ryukyu Islands, Formosa, and Luzon, October 10th through 17th, 1944, with over 1,000 American planes in the air at the time. This force destroyed 915 enemy planes and hundreds of naval vessels. Since Japanese naval planes had been critically reduced in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and since most of these destroyed in Halsey's sweep were land-based, the Japanese were critically short of trained pilots after October 17th and began to adopt kamikaze suicide tactics. Well, that might be why you're running out of pilots, though, too. In these tactics, half-trained pilots dived their planes loaded with bombs onto the decks of American ships. These new tactics inflicted severe losses on the Americans in the next few months. In the week of October 17th through 24th, Halsey's Third Fleet was back off Leyte to cover the invasion force of 732 ships. In 5 days, 132,000 men and 200,000 tons of supplies were landed against only moderate opposition. To destroy this landing, the Japanese gave orders which resulted in the Battle of Leyte, the largest naval conflict in history. The eastern shore of the Philippines may be regarded as two very large islands, Luzon on the north and Mindanao, no, Mindanao to the south, separated by a cluster of smaller islands, the Visayas, which included almost contiguous Samir and Leyte on the eastern shore. Between Luzon and Samar was San Bernardino Strait, while further south, Leyte and Mindanao were separated by Surigao Strait. The Japanese plan was to send a small force as bait from Japan to entice Halsey's Third Fleet northeast from Luzon, while three other Japanese forces, one from Japan and two from Singapore, would secretly approach from the west, with the center force under Admiral Takao Kurita passing through San Bernardino Strait, and the southern force under Admirals Kiyohide Shima and Shioji Nishimura passing through Surigao Strait to converge on Admiral Frederick C. Sherman's Seventh Fleet to destroy both it and the late beachhead before Halsey could return from his northern pursuit of Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa's sacrificial bait. These plans, requiring precise timing and ruthless execution, failed only because the quality of American fighting men was so superior to that of Japanese admirals that it overcame Japanese superiority in guns and ships in actual combat. The resulting Battle of Leyte ended the Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. On one side were 216 American and 2 Australian ships with 143,000 men plus many auxiliary vessels, while the enemy had 64 major ships manned by 42,000 Japanese. The Japanese northern force was made up of 2 heavy and 1 large and 2 small carriers, which could no longer be used as carriers because of the lack of naval aviators. These 6 vessels, escorted by 3 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, sailed down from Japan to entice Bull Halsey's Third Fleet, with almost all the American heavy striking power, northward away from Leyte Landing. Unexpectedly, it escaped observation until October 24th, a day later than expected, and had to sail in circles, waiting for Halsey to come north. In the meantime, Kurita's center force, which hoped to remain undetected, had been intercepted by American submarines and reported. This Japanese force, headed for San Bernardino Strait, had 7 battleships, including the 2 largest in the world of 86,000 tons with 18.1-inch guns, 11 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 19 destroyers. All these major vessels were faster and heavier than comparable American ships, but had little air cover, poor fire control, and inferior morale. On October 23rd, the American submarine Darter and Dace torpedoed 3 of Kurita's heavy cruisers, sinking 2, including Kurita's flagship. While Kurita was being rescued from the water and dried out, Halsey, warned by Darter, sent an airstrike over the top of the Philippines and sank the 86-ton battleship Muashi with 19 torpedoes and 17 bomb hits, and also knocked out a heavy cruiser. Hours earlier, Japanese land planes from Luzon made a strike at Halsey and were mostly destroyed, but a single bomb exploding in the carrier Princeton's Bakery set a fire which ignited its torpedoes and aviation gasoline and blew it apart. inflicting heavy casualties on the cruiser Birmingham, which had come to the rescue. When Halsey's planes returning from west of the Philippines gave exaggerated reports on the damage to Kurita and announced that he had turned westward, Halsey took off with 65 ships, including all his heavy vessels, northward to where Ozawa's bait of 17 ships was patiently circling. Kurita, 7 hours behind schedule, resumed course to San Bernardino Strait and Leyte Gulf. In the meantime, two other Japanese forces were converging on Surigao Strait, far to the north. Together they had 2 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 8 destroyers. Their approach was reported to the American 7th Fleet off Leyte. This moved southward to meet the threat at Surigao Strait, assuming that Halsey would continue to cover San Bernardino Strait. The intercepting force of Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, 7th Fleet, had 6 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 28 destroyers, and 6 maids a-milking. As the Japanese southern force plowed through Surigao Strait in the long, dark night of October 24th through 25th, it was attacked by 30 PT boats. These were dispersed after great confusion. Then came more than 100 torpedoes from American destroyers, scoring 9 hits, which sank 3 Japanese destroyers and a battleship. Gunfire from the American heavy ships then sank most of the southern force. Damaged vessels were pursued by air and submarine until November 5th. Only 1 cruiser and 5 destroyers of the whole force were still afloat. The 7th Fleet disengaged from the remnants of the southern force at 5 a.m. on October 25th. The main Japanese force, under Kurita, 175 miles to the north, had emerged from San Bernardino Strait and was bearing down on Leyte, which was protected by a flotilla of 6 escort carriers with a screen of 7 destroyers under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. These small vessels were off Samar Island with about 25 planes each and were backed by 2 similar flotillas farther south. Surprise was complete on both sides at 6:47 a.m. when a patrol plane discovered Kurita's presence. The news had hardly registered when the Japanese big guns opened fire. Fortunately, Kurita was completely disconcerted by the encounter and believed he had run into Halsey's fleet. Sprague, under cover of smoke screens and rain squalls, tried to escape the heavy Japanese gunfire while holding the enemy out of Leyte Gulf. By vigorous airstrikes from his baby flat tops and torpedo attacks from his destroyers, the Japanese shells of 5 to 16-inch caliber were all armor-piercing and went through the thin plates of Sprague's vessels without exploding, but with up to 40 holes each, these ships were soon leaking freely. They attacked so vigorously, however, using their 5-inch guns when all torpedoes were gone, that Kurita's fleet was scattered, and he decided to withdraw to regroup his forces. He had sunk 2 American destroyers, an escort carrier, and a destroyer escort, but lost 3 heavy cruisers in return. By this time, 9:15 a.m., air attacks were beginning to come in from all over the Philippines, and Kurita had received news that only 1 destroyer had survived the Southern forces' defeat at Surigao. He began to withdraw through San Bernardino Strait. Sprague's escort carriers were much cut up and still under heavy pounding from the earliest kamikaze attacks. These sank St. Lo, an escort carrier, about 11:30. At 8:45 a.m., urgent appeals to Admiral Halsey had detached a force of 5 fast carriers with escort vessels to pursue Kurita. 2 hours later, while still 335 miles away, these launched a series of air attacks, 147 planes in all, of which 14 were lost without significant damage to the Japanese. The following day, strikes of 257 planes sank another of Kurita's cruisers. During this same eventful October 25th, Admiral Ozawa's northern force, the bait had been swallowed, and 5 air attacks totaling 527 planes, Halsey's carriers, commanded by Admiral Mishter, sank 4 Japanese carriers and a destroyer. Among these was the last of 6 carriers which had attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. The Battle of Leyte, strategically ill-advised from the Japanese point of view, ended its navy as a significant force in the Pacific. From that date, the American advance was held up chiefly by suicide tactics, the kamikaze attacks. Leyte is of great historical significance as the last naval battle in which battleships participated and played a role, admittedly minor. The Third Fleet's battle line of 6 great ships did not even fire its heavy guns. While General MacArthur and the army were clearing up the Philippines, capturing Manila after fierce house-to-house combat on March 14, 1945, the army and air arms pressed on towards Japan. By October 1st, 1944, 2 intermediate targets had been set. One was to capture Iwo Jima on the Bonin Islands, about halfway from Saipan to Tokyo, to be used as an emergency landing area and fighter plane base for the B-29s attacking Tokyo from Saipan. The other was to capture Okinawa and other islands in the Ryukyu as bases for land forces to invade Japan itself. Right. I think that's kind of a good place to stop here. Still about 10 more pages in that chapter. So, all right. We kind of ended most of the German assaults. We saw that it was just basically a lot of air raids at the end. They just kept, it was basically Britain, the United States, and Russia air bombing the crap out of Germany. Hitler went nuts, committed suicide, allegedly. He might be in South America. Well, I mean, he'd be too old now to be alive now, but he could have fled to South America along with other, Nazis. It seems like it was proven that some of them did flee to South America. And then, as planned, they started their attack on Japan, basically taking over all the tiny islands around Japan, staging a base in Australia, and then the smaller islands, and then basically doing a similar thing to Hitler, a type of like pincer attack where they come in from both sides and then try to take over, pinning the enemy force in between 2 separate forces coming at them from both sides. Kind of interesting. Battleship history. I remember my grandpa, he used to take me down to the Intrepid like a couple times when I would visit him in New York. He'd be like, oh man, you gotta check out this battleship, huge guns. He's like, this is kind of like the ship that I went on when I went over there. And he used to build model ships and planes and stuff like that when he got pretty old. So, kind of interesting. Interesting that was the last battleship battle. I remember playing that game when I was young. Battleship. Oh, you sunk my battleship. Kind of a fun game. Kids probably don't play that anymore because they got like PlayStation and Xbox and stuff, but it was pretty fun. Of course, this scene right here is from Dr. Strangelove. If you haven't seen that movie, it's definitely a must-watch Kubrick film, I think. All right, so I'm gonna get out of here with that. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this. Otherwise, have a good day and peace.